All right, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of O365Eh. Today's topic, we're going to be discussing guest access, and I'm going to ask Dino to lead it off.
Great, thanks, Hab. So when we talk about guest access, this is really just a feature that provides the ability for users not within your organization to participate in teams. So it's not really federation. You might think, hey, that's like federation in Skype, but it really isn't that. But Microsoft's first approach at allowing you to collaborate externally with other non-users of your company was something called guest access. So it's obviously important that you are able to collaborate with others outside of your company. So that's how guest access was born. Initially, this feature required the guest to be part of an organization that also had Office 365. So, this was limiting who you could participate with. So the person also had to, have their appropriate licenses and their own tenant to collaborate with you. However, recently we now have the ability to invite anyone to Teams with their personal email account, like an Outlook or Gmail or Hotmail account. So what happens is they would associate that account with a Microsoft account or an MSA, as you might hear. So I could send an invite out to a Gmail user, and if they don't already have that Gmail account associated with a Microsoft account, then they would do that, and that's what would effectively allow them access into your team to participate as a guest. So once they're invited, they go through a redemption process that allows them to begin participating in the team and chatting with users in the various channels, adding content, participating in meetings, that type of thing. So it's really quite almost the full experience for that particular user. And it's important to note that all the guests in Teams are covered by the same compliance and auditing protection as the rest of Office 365. So, and the guests can also be managed securely within the Azure Active Directory.
Yeah, so the guest access is included with all the Office 365 Business Premium, Enterprise, and Education subscriptions. So there's no additional separate license for guest access. It's kind of included in what you have already today. It is a tenant level setting within the Microsoft Teams services, and it's disabled by default. So a tenant admin would have to turn that on to be consumed. But Teams is built upon the Office 365 groups. So this guest access is the authentication is actually provided and managed by Azure Active Directory, business to consumer or B2C, which then means it does have some of the inherent limitations of Azure AD. So you're limited to about 500,000 objects in a single directory if you're using the free edition of Azure AD. If you had, additional licensing, you can expand on that. And if you're a non-admin user, you can only create up to a maximum of 250 objects. And so that's total objects. So if you have some users that are managing some large teams and they're, constantly adding guests to that, you can definitely consume that or hit that limit.
Yeah, so in addition to that, from a security perspective, as Mike mentioned, so the accounts are actually stored in Azure Active Directory, and that's primarily where the focus of the security levels resides as far as the account is concerned. So what happens after that is there's 3 additional places that that you can manage the restriction on the guest access itself, or manage them, I should say. So one of them is obviously in Microsoft Teams. You can enable or add guest access or guest users within a team. The other, as Mike mentioned, Office 365 groups, which Teams leverages. And then Teams also leverages SharePoint Online and OneDrive Online. But these other services like Office 365 groups, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business can be managed mutually exclusive of Teams itself. So you don't necessarily have to be managing a team to enable guest user access and provide, different authorizations, right? The interesting thing is from a security perspective on these different services like SharePoint or OneDrive, from that perspective, you can explicitly state, or even Office 365, I should say, you can explicitly state what permissions a non-admin can do. So you can say that non-admins are not allowed to administer guest access permissions to external entities. And what that means is that the IT admins would then take over ownership of managing the guest access within those different, services, right? So that's another interesting tweak, I guess, from a security aspect of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned security, Habib. One interesting thing that organizations will have to watch out for that when they adopt teams is, given the nature of teams, you can imagine new teams will be spun up quite a bit, and you can easily end up with team sprawl, which in itself is not a big problem. I think the Teams client is well engineered to handle a lot of different teams, but the thing to watch out for in terms of guest access is team sprawl means Office 365 group sprawl, because as we know, generally when you create a team, that creates an Office 365 group under the covers. And that Office 365 group controls the permissions to all the underlying resources like the Exchange shared mailbox, the associated SharePoint site collection. And when you add guest access to a team, it's actually adding that guest access to the Office 365 group and the resources that belong to that group. So as Office 365 group sprawl happens, and guest access is enabled and people are adding external guests to these groups, it should be interesting to see how organizations handle things like stale groups. So if their hygiene around groups isn't good, you'll end up with a lot of data and a lot of services that potentially can have external guest access that is gone unchecked or uncontrolled. So that's something for organizations to really pay attention to. I noticed Microsoft released an Azure AD feature called Access Review, and it allows organizations to do manual reviews of external access in Azure AD, including the Office 365 groups that is the underpinnings of Teams. That is a P2 license, so organizations will have to make a call whether it's worth their money just to do those external access reviews. They could do it by themselves with some PowerShell scripts, just enumerating through the Office 365 groups, producing reports that show the last activity in the group and who has external access. And also, I was just looking from what can an external user do, a guest user. If you do a quick search, there's some nice charts up there, but basically, external guests can create channels, join private chats, join public conversations, post, do a lot of the basic functionality. But what they can't do is they can't create a new team. They can't discover and join public teams, schedule meetings, or view organizational charts. So sort of a nice summary of what external guests can and can't do. But what has everyone's experience been like with guest access?
Yeah, so I mean, quite honestly, I've had it's challenging to use in that it's a bit clunky in terms of authentication. So obviously, the first thing you're presented with when you start to use guest access is you'll be presented with another auth box, and you have to type in your credentials. And that can happen a couple of times for a variety of reasons. So that in and of itself is quite annoying. Have to continually authenticate. But even bigger than that is the fact that when you join, when you're being part of that guest, you're kind of like left your team and you're now participating in this other team. You're not really, you're losing sight and track of what's happening in your own tenant. So, why that's important is, if you get a phone call, for example, if you're one of the few companies, and more that are going to be cutting over and using voice on Teams, then you'll miss a phone call, for example. And that's pretty important. So I don't like that you have to be separate. I want that notion of federation to be there, and I think that that's something that's coming. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the big thing is guest access is definitely not federation. So those that are used to Skype for Business Federation, they're used to, interacting with all these organizations and kind of living within their home pool or their home tenant. Guest access, you're technically signing into that other organization's Teams tenant with that back business to consumer account. So you are signing out of your home tenant, signing into that other organization's tenant with their credentials that they've given to you for a guest. So it is definitely a different experience if you're used to federation. The problem is you can only sign into one at a time. So I did release a multi-teams client on my blog. Basically, it allows you to open up multiple instances of the Electron app, so you can have, sign into some guest access, sign into your home tenant. But without that easy tenant switching, you kind of have to be in multi-pane to deal with that, especially if you're doing a lot of work in your home tenant and then as well as in other organizations. But if you're just like a contractor and you're fully into that as a guest access, then the experience is fine. You're only having to manage one team or one team's tenant.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of my concerns is that external access in Azure is enabled by default, right? So I don't think a lot of companies are really doing that sort of thought process and flow charts on how to enable guest access and how to properly manage it. It's sort of just turned on by default, and the users are utilizing it, which is great. You want the user adoption to happen, but I think from an IT pro management perspective, you want to be able to know exactly sort of what the flow is going to be, who's going to be able to manage it, and direct the access to the appropriate location. So I think it's just enabled by default, and so that, to me, is a bit of a concern, so that it can be used right away, not just with Teams, but with OneDrive. I can share files externally with external users, so on and so forth. Right? So,
I think it ties back into what Curtis was saying about, some organizations should really look into those premium licenses for Azure AD, like that P2. Once you get those premium add-ons for Azure AD, you get, you don't have those limits on how many objects you have. You now have the ability to do a little bit more auditing on the Office 365 groups. There's going to be a bigger push for those, moving away from the free Azure AD SKU.
It's more about the planning, I think, from the beginning, right? So just planning, making sure that you're set up before you release it into your environment. But yeah, I definitely agree about the P2 licensing. And I was also just reading here as well. You don't have to buy that on I don't think you have to buy that on a tenant level. I think you can just buy that licensing and associate it to specific users that want to have that functionality.
Yeah, it is a good point, because there's some other features with P2. I think the group policy expiration, and the group naming policies for Azure AD, I could be wrong about this, but I think they're actually included in P2 also. So just more knobs and controls with the P2 license to control this group sprawl problem that could potentially be in play for a number of organizations. I will say one thing I do like about how Microsoft has implemented this external guest access, from a security perspective, I really like the fact that the external guest gets an account in Azure AD, because then there's an identity there that can be traced. It can be put in audit logs. That's fantastic. And I think the challenge is, like Dino pointed towards, Michael, you said it best. It's just the difference between federation and guest access. Federation, you're part of the experience. You're not flipping context all the time. But the real challenge right now, as Dino alluded to, if you are a guest in multiple tenants, you could be missing communication very easily, which is a challenge.
Yeah, and it takes away from the not only missing, but it's difficult to switch between. Like, I find when I'm a guest in one tenant, I'm active there, participating, and then it's hard to be able to do both. Like with Skype, I can have multiple windows open and participating in many conversations easily, without having to sign out and do a bunch of different things. So I think that when that, once that federation feature comes, fingers crossed, we can go back to working in that sort of mode.
Well, until then, it seems like Michael's got you covered with his application.
Yeah.
At Real
for
Time UC. All right, thanks for joining, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks.
See ya.